Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps as everyone sort of settles and tries to find a space, I could welcome everyone today. For those of you who don't know me, and a lot of you do, I'm Andrew Shearer, Director of Studies at the Lowy Institute, and it's really great to see such a turnout today for an Institute event. It looks like it's standing room only, and that's very gratifying for us to see. This event is part of a series that we call Food for Thought, and that series represents an effort by the Lowy Institute to take to cities beyond Sydney our two core missions, which are to stimulate debate in Australia about international policy issues and also to engage in the policy debate on those issues. So it's great to see you here, and we're committed to continuing to come to Canberra and hopefully over time building a more regular presence here. Of course, the purpose of today's event is to launch Crisis and Confidence, the latest paper in our MacArthur Asia Security Project. We launched the project with the publication over a year ago now of Power and Choice, a major paper which identified a series of different alternative Asian security futures and sought to stimulate debate about how shifting power balances in Asia might shape those different futures and how the choices of Asia's powers, in particular the major powers, might determine the final result of that process. In that paper, we painted a picture of a more dynamic, contested region than we've been used to for much of the last 60 years. A region which in many ways will be a much less comfortable one for Australia and for the pursuit of our interests. We pointed to the strength of the competitive dynamics in the region, which will challenge over time the more integrative aspects of the region, such as economic ties, growing trade and investment links and so on, and also the common imperatives of responding to major transnational trends. We set out how we thought these dynamics were likely to constrain the potential for meaningful security cooperation and, in the worst case, could possibly create the conditions for conflict. Since Power and Choice, we've conducted field work in Japan, China, the United States, Singapore and Indonesia. We've engaged with officials and academics all around Asia and here in Australia. We've held a major conference on maritime security with the US Naval War College, and we've produced a series of other reports, including Secrecy and Stratagem, which attempted to investigate China's emerging strategic culture, and Strategic Snapshots, which are shorter pieces that provide regional perspectives on these issues by experts like Mike Green, Raja Mohan, Renato De Castro. We have another snapshot by Toshi Yoshihara at the US Naval War College, which we will release shortly, and that will focus on the strategic rationale for an increased US military presence in Australia. In the course of this work, one thing has become increasingly clear to us, and that is that many of the assumptions we've had for the last few decades about the regional order, and in particular about the maritime security order in Asia, are under challenge today. I think it's fitting that today the US Navy commences major exercises off the Philippines with the Philippines Navy, and this exercise will follow other similar exercises conducted over the last few months with South Korea and other regional navies. This activity, of course, is largely in response to China's growing capabilities and China's growing assertiveness, and to questions still unanswered about what those developments mean for China's longer-term intentions. Crisis and Confidence highlights the risks posed by these new military capabilities and doctrines, and in particular by growing uncertainty about these longer-term intentions. It looks at how these factors will intersect with long-standing territorial disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, with growing energy insecurity in Asia, and with clashing perspectives on fundamental questions such as freedom of navigation, something which has underpinned over 60 years of relative stability and prosperity in our region. And it highlights, I think, very usefully, the weakness of existing institutions in the region and the absence of confidence-building measures to constrain some of these competitive dynamics. Crisis and Confidence, like our other work in the project, takes a hard-headed and pragmatic approach. It's realistic about the competitive dynamics in the region and the risks, while avoiding determinism, the idea that conflict is somehow inevitable. I'd like to congratulate my colleagues and friends, Rory, Raoul and Justin, on an excellent piece of work. I'd like to thank the rest of the Lowy team for supporting the work very ably, the MacArthur Foundation for making this project possible, and all our other stakeholders, many of whom are here today. Thank you, and over to Rory.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And again, I'm really delighted to see such a good turnout today. Really, at the core of this paper, this publication, there are three questions. Two of them are mysteries, to use that popular term among intelligence analysts, and one of them is really a policy problem. The mysteries are why the incidents at sea that we are seeing in Maritime Asia, that we've seen in recent years, that we're continuing to see. Secondly, where could these incidents lead? The policy problem, of course, is simply what to do about it. Under conditions of continued mistrust, which I think we should accept as a starting point of this analysis, what realistically can be done to reduce the likelihood of crisis, of escalation, of conflict from these incidents. Recent events, of course, have made this paper all the more timely. I'm glad to say that there's been a slight easing of some of the tensions in the South China Sea over the last few days, high-level talks between the US and China, between China and Vietnam. But I think the structural drivers and the mysterious mix of causes of these incidents, I believe, are not going to go away. So I think we're seeing a temporary calm, but certainly not a long-term solution. I guess that emphasises the continuing relevance, in our view, of this paper. Look, in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll briefly take you through some of the analysis, some of the recommendations emerging from this paper, and I'll try to be frank with you about the continuing gaps in our understanding. There's a lot more work to be done on this subject. So, to quickly run through, this image is from the cover of the paper, and I guess you can read what symbolism into it you will. The tensions that we've seen recently in the South China Sea, incidents involving China and the Philippines, China and Vietnam, are not the only area of focus for the problem we looked at. We deliberately took a wide geographic view of the region, which we're terming the Indo-Pacific or Indo-Pacific Asia, looking at it increasingly as one strategic system. We focused on not only the South China Sea, but in particular the major power tensions, China-Japan, the tensions occurring around the Korean Peninsula, and the South China Sea, insofar as it has the potential to bring in the United States and other players. We also looked a little at the emerging competition between China and India and others in the Indian Ocean, but that's certainly a bit further down the track in time. Our analysis takes the view that these international sea lanes, the lines of communication, are mattering more to more powers as their economic interests expand, their trading interests expand, their resource needs expand, and in many cases, their naval capabilities are growing. We looked at the maritime disputes on China's periphery, China's edge, which are essentially unresolved. There's an enormous contrast between China's quite effective management of many, not all of its land border differences over the years, and the unresolved nature of its maritime differences. We focused on the changing maritime capabilities in the region, and then we tried to zoom in on the incidents at sea that we've seen increasingly, I'd say, in the last 3 years. Of course, there were earlier incidents, the EP3 collision back in 2001, but really since around the time of the harassment of the US surveillance ship, the Impeccable, in 2009, there has been an increased tempo of these incidents, and we wanted to try to discern what was driving them. That's an image from the rather infamous Impeccable incident in 2009, where a small flotilla of Chinese vessels from all sorts of agencies, not just or specifically the Navy, harassed a US surveillance ship off the Chinese coast. The drivers that our paper focuses on, and I should emphasise that much of this is based not only on, I guess, traditional academic research, but also on our direct discussions with policymakers and with thinkers in many of the countries concerned, including China. The drivers that we identified, many of them boil down to a strategic level of mistrust, relating in part to the changing power balances that we identify in our first report, Power and Choice. But there are other factors at work too. One is not only the changing maritime capabilities of these countries, the growth, for example, of the Chinese Navy, and much of this analysis is necessarily China-centric for reasons we can, I guess, go into in the Q&A. The anti-access strategy that we're seeing developed in China, which of course at its core involves an ability to push US and other forces further from the Chinese coast than in the past, for example, to reduce the amount of surveillance that's carried on close to China that would obviously help US deterrence in a crisis. But the strategies of Japan and the United States as well. Japan and the US and others are increasingly relying on not only longer range surveillance but also patrolling, longer range patrolling, increased risks of encounters with one another, encounters with Chinese forces as a result of this, I guess, necessary element of their deterrence strategy. And if we see the air-sea battle strategy, which is essentially now only a concept, but if we see this very surveillance-intensive strategy and indeed, I guess, strategy with a defensive-offensive edge, if you like, if we see this evolve, we'll see more likelihood of or more scope for encounters, just as if we see China's anti-access strategy evolve, we'll see more likelihood of encounters. Clashing sovereignty claims. I think a fundamental difference between the strategic environment we're looking at and, let's say, the maritime environment during the Cold War, when there was, again, a problem of incidents at sea, is the sovereignty dimension. The fact that, especially from a Chinese point of view, this is not simply a matter of averting incidents, averting misunderstandings or averting escalation, but overlaying this strategic mistrust, overlaying these operational drivers of encounters at sea are clashing sovereignty claims really right along the Chinese maritime periphery. And the China-Japan relationship, China's relations with some Southeast Asian powers and ultimately with the United States are very much informed by that. There's some more intangible factors at work that our research identified. We hear about this a lot, but I think I think we tend to underestimate the impact of these dimensions. And by that I mean nationalism. I mean a sense of confidence, perhaps overconfidence, that we've seen particularly in China in recent years, where growing economic weight, growing status in the world has translated perhaps into some prematurely overconfident actions by the PLA Navy and by other agencies. The humiliation question, the fact that I think in Chinese strategic thought, in Chinese culture, there is a sense that US surveillance of the Chinese coastline today can be seen as having an echoing the traditional or the historical humiliation and of China by seaborne powers going back to the 20th and 19th centuries. Clashing resource needs and energy insecurity. all of these factors put together, I think, help us to understand the upsurge of incidents at sea in recent years. But there's still one mystery which remains, and that is the role of different agencies within China. We did not take the view in this analysis that China is a monolith, that Chinese strategy is somehow predetermined by, I guess, drivers of culture or power or national interest, but that there are agencies and even competing actors within agencies at work in China. And certainly our discussions with Chinese think tanks illuminated those debates somewhat, although we concluded that hardline views were generally currently in the ascendant. But it's interesting to observe that in many of the incidents in recent years, it hasn't been the PLA Navy that's been the primary actor. It's been actually other auxiliary agencies, whether it's fisheries, surveillance, patrolling, Coast Guard and so forth. And one has to ask the question, do they have their own agendas? Now, the risks and the consequences of these incidents, and again, we looked at a broad spectrum of incidents, not only Navy to Navy, but involving auxiliaries, fisheries and others, including between China and Japan. The risks and consequences are really what it's all about, and we certainly didn't take the view that there is an inevitability to conflict arising from these incidents. It's very likely that most incidents will continue to be, if not managed well, at least accommodated, tolerated. Neither player, in our view, is looking for a fight, even though there's a lot of provocation and brinksmanship going on. But we do take the view, and our research, I think, reinforced this, that despite some of the temporary respite we might be seeing, the frictions that we've identified from the drivers that we've identified are likely to persist and worsen unless some of these drivers of frictions are addressed. And we don't see easy solutions in addressing those drivers, hence our focus on confidence-building measures, which I'll come to in a moment. The risks we see as having 3 or even 4 levels, and they're identified on this slide. Now, there's the obvious risk of a diplomatic crisis. We saw that in Sino-Japanese relations last year with the collision and then arrest involving a Chinese fishing boat, Japanese Coast Guard, off the Senkaku Islands. A wide diplomatic crisis that threw that relationship into a really a deeper, steeper decline than in many years. And that kind of contribution to strategic mistrust is going to have impacts later on. It actually makes it harder to build communication and confidence. Also, the risk of actual use of force. Now, this could be warning shots, it could be an exchange of fire, it could be something that's very easily managed and controlled involving one or both sides. But we do take the view that without channels of continuous communication between some of these forces, essentially China and other maritime forces, we can't rule out the risk of wider clashes, wider escalation, perhaps a war or a warlike situation evolving from a seemingly rather petty incident. We also took the view in the analysis that ultimately these problems can't be restricted to East Asia alone, to the seas off China's coast alone. I certainly think that a lot of the speculation about Sino-Indian rivalry, string of pearls, an active Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean is a bit premature. But the fundamental drivers we've identified, especially the energy and security issue, suggests that over time the Chinese role in the Indian Ocean will grow. There's obviously a lot of Indian nervousness about that, and we feel that we conclude that it would make sense to start addressing some of these frictions almost in anticipation in the Sino-Indian relationship and other relationships involving China in the Indian Ocean, perhaps ahead of time, perhaps learning some of the lessons from East Asia and applying them in the Indian Ocean. So, how does one cope with instability under conditions of mistrust? This was a fundamental question that we kept coming back to. As I've said, we're not saying that every incident will escalate. We do see a degree of political choice or of at least decision makers' individual choice at play here, but we think the risks of escalation are obviously too big to ignore. we were really struck in our research by how flimsy and ill-prepared the region's architecture of so-called confidence-building measures is. China's attitude to CBMs has changed somewhat over the years. If you read the Chinese Defence White Paper, there's some pretty heartwarming stuff there about the role of CBMs in China's land relationships, China, Russia, China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation and so forth. But at sea, the picture remains quite different. And we were struck, for example, by the emphasis that most Chinese thinking continues to place on somehow building political trust before confidence-building measures can be enacted between militaries, which, in our view, is putting the cart before the horse. And even where the last point on this page, even where there are nominally CBMs in place, in theory, a hotline between the leaders of China and India, in theory, hotlines between China and Japan, China and the US. There is very little evidence that these have ever been used in a tense situation, and there have been tense moments since those hotlines were announced in recent years. Now, it's not all bad news, I'll grant that, and we'll see here from this very friendly Chinese visit to Pearl Harbor that there are at least efforts at what we'd call indirect confidence-building measures. That is, the broad military engagement that occurs away from contested zones, that occurs in a broader relationship. The sorts of ship visits we've seen in recent years, even the very loose cooperation we've seen between the Chinese and other navies against piracy in the Indian Ocean. What we are observing, though, from our research is that much more direct CBMs in our terminology, that is continuous communication, hotlines, and ultimately some sort of formal agreement to manage or prevent incidents at sea, the architecture is very thin to non-existent in the region. And there seems little appetite, particularly at the moment on the Chinese side, for those direct CBMs. Although I'd add that we shouldn't pretend that it's somehow officially stated US policy at this stage to have an incidents at sea agreement with China. So the challenge is on both sides. Now, as for the limits of CBMs, another pretty central part of the analysis that we encountered, and incidentally, this is I think this photo was taken by my colleague Ashley Townsend on a Chinese goodwill visit to Sydney last year. So the CBM's picture goes beyond major power to major power relations. The limits of CBMs that we looked at were pretty stark. The most obvious, as I've said, is this fundamental difference of view about what the purpose of CBMs actually is. The trust versus CBMs paradox, if you want to call it that. Now, it's not completely black and white. There is a spectrum of views within China. There's obviously a spectrum of views in Washington and elsewhere. This simple idea that trust should somehow precede CBMs is beginning to break down a little bit in China. We saw some interesting rhetoric recently from the Chinese Defence Minister at the Shangri-La dialogue, where he actually said, I quote, "Trust starts with engagement." Now that is actually quite a different formulation to the Chinese Defence White Paper's view that political trust should be the groundwork for CBMs. We can, argue the theology of all of this, but it does seem to be that there is a debate occurring within China on that issue. However, going by China's actions, at the moment there is still very little evidence of CBMs being put in place in the absence of what they see as strategic trust. And these differences ultimately stem from clashes over strategic interests. For example, if one were to try and drill a bit deeper and ask Chinese interlocutors, what does political trust mean between the US and China at sea, or between China and other powers at sea, we'll start hearing language even now about respecting one another's core interests. And then, of course, we get to a very vital question about what those core interests actually are. The message that we received, interestingly, during our research consultations in China on this was that the view that China has declared the South China Sea to be a core interest is actually somewhat overblown, that in fact China hasn't fundamentally changed its view on this. But of course Chinese actions in recent months suggest that at least in some elements in Beijing there's still a pretty hardline view on that question. Now, we concluded that there's a need to reduce the risks from incidents at sea without waiting to build political and strategic trust. Now, that sounds like a statement of the obvious, but it is a message, again, that really needs to be reinforced, particularly in Beijing, because, as I said, it's not readily accepted there. So we identified a set of recommendations, I'd say probably 8 or 9 key recommendations in our paper. I'm happy to unpack these a bit more in the Q&A with my colleagues on what modest steps we can take to really increase stability at sea, assuming that core strategic interests of major powers are not magically going to be reconciled overnight. So we'll run through these briefly. Look, we became rather pessimistic from much of this research, I have to say, but we still recognise that it's worth trying CBMs. It's worth trying to increase US-China military dialogue. It's worth trying to encourage dialogue between the forces of China and other powers, including auxiliary forces, not only navies. There's not a lot to lose from this effort. And before I go further on that, I should say that there are different views on this. I mean, for example, some of our Japanese interlocutors took the view that Australia, the United States and others shouldn't go too far in their CBMs with China at times when, for example, China and Japan are having a pretty tense relationship at sea. But we tended to take the view that allies, as long as they coordinate and communicate to one another, can and should maintain their engagement with China, even when another ally is having a pretty tough time. And Australia has a role to play there, I should say. At the same time, simultaneously maintaining US and allied deterrence and reassurance, we've seen in incidents in the last year or so that the reaction of solidarity among many Southeast Asian countries with the United States and others has actually been, I think, one of the factors, really a central factor in the relative restraint we've seen from China early this year, breaking down with the Philippines and Vietnam. But nonetheless, 2011 has generally been a slightly more pleasant year at sea in the region than 2010 was. So we do see certainly a role for deterrence and reassurance of allies in actually reducing the incidence of incidents at sea. We've also concluded that there needs to be sustained effort to keep trying to persuade those within the Chinese system who adhere to the hard line on trust preceding CBMs that actually it's in China's interests to reduce the risks from incidents at sea. And as I said, there is an internal debate on this in China. We have some interesting Chinese language sources in our paper that reinforce that view. We think that the actual implementation of the existing nominal CBMs is pretty vital. The fact that there are US-China hotlines, or a nominal US-China hotline that, to our knowledge, hasn't been used in a tense situation is obviously a real shame. And we'd like to see movement on that. The Japanese have expressed frustration to us that a hotline that was agreed and announced last year has not actually been implemented, partly because there are differing views on how on earth it is to be used, whether it's to offer advance notice of manoeuvres or whether it's simply to talk about issues after they've happened. And we're told that one of the fundamental problems there is that the Chinese view is that hotline should be routed through the Foreign Affairs Office of the Ministry of Defence, which is obviously not what you would call a real-time communication channel. So there's a lot of work, institutional work to be done there. We think there's a place for better crisis management, better coordination within and among US allies. We've particularly noted that Japan's crisis response mechanisms could still do with some improvement after the often inconsistent response to the Senkaku's crisis last year. Japan sometimes sort of blew hot and then blew cold, sometimes took a firm stance against China, sometimes didn't. And as far as we can tell, that was due to a lot of institutional weaknesses within Japan. We feel that it would be a good signal to China if US allies could basically do everything in their power to make their own crisis management mechanisms and coordination mechanisms a model response. We think there is a role to explore new mechanisms for bilateral talks. I've identified earlier the China-India relationship, and we see no reason why a Sino-Indian maritime dialogue couldn't get started anytime soon, and there's no reason why India couldn't be, I guess, the initiating force on that. I think the Indians have to accept that China is going to have a role in the Indian Ocean, that China has legitimate interests in the Indian Ocean, and I think it would make sense for the Indians to work now from a position of strength to initiate a maritime security dialogue with the Chinese. As I've said, there are roles, I think, for other powers, including Australia. When I say smaller, I don't say small, incidentally. We do think Australia carries some weight on this issue. To maintain their engagement with China, even during times of tension involving other powers, the fact that the China-US defence dialogue, military dialogue relationship was frankly suspended for much of last year, was no reason for Australia to suspend its own contact with China, and we didn't. We actually had a better year in our defence engagement with China than the year before, for a whole range of reasons. And as I understand it, both the United States and China see some value in Australia maintaining its role during those times of tension. In fact, I think in some ways Australia is a good country to test the limits of defence engagement with China. We think there should be a much greater focus on maritime security in multilateral forums in the region. Again, that may be wishful thinking, but it was good to see sustained effort last year by the US and a number of countries to really get maritime security problems onto the agenda of not only the ASEAN Regional Forum, but also the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting +8. And we think this should be persisted with. We think it's a matter of time before China has to accept that this is essentially how the rest of the region sees it. I was told by one Chinese interlocutor that if China hadn't turned up to the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting +8 last year, because of its insistence on discussing the South China Sea, or the forum's insistence on discussing the South China Sea, that would have been a failure of regional security architecture. Our view would be it would be a failure of regional security architecture if these forums don't discuss really the big strategic issues that could lead to conflict. The last two of our recommendations, we don't outright argue that the US and China should get about negotiating an incidents at sea agreement, and that's partly for the very practical and realistic reason that neither side seems to be convinced that it's in its interest to do so at the moment. But the door should be kept open to that. Preliminary discussions should take place. The risk that we've heard from US, Japanese and other interlocutors is that the very negotiations of an incidents at sea agreement with China could essentially get bogged down in disputes over sovereignty and prestige and so forth. And certainly there's a big mistrust in China of formal agreements. But we think that the time will come when this issue has to be confronted. Finally, as a word of advice to our US friends, and we know that there are many in the US system who would like to see this happen and that there are obviously political constraints on it, but nonetheless, our research reinforced the view that until the US ratifies the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, its bargaining position, or at least its moral and legal position in really pushing the case for freedom of navigation to defend its right to surveillance in Chinese territory, exclusive economic zone, is going to be diminished. As I said at the outset, China wants to push the US surveillance out of its 200 nautical mile EEZ. At the moment, of course, the majority, I guess, interpretation of the law of the sea is that only the 12 nautical mile territorial waters are, I guess, barred to that kind of activity. We don't see this issue going away. We see that China will continue to press its position on this and occasionally do it through obstructive and forceful means. And we think that this particular change by the United States would help considerably in dealing with that challenge. So that's a quick summary of our conclusions. I might end there and ask my co-authors and Andrew to join me in handling any questions you've got on this paper. Thank you.
You did say, Rory, that you thought CBMs have to come before trust. Was that because you believe that trust in any useful sense is unachievable? Some people, not necessarily myself, would say that the only kind of trust you can rely on in these situations is trust that the other side will do what it perceives to be in its own interests, and those interests do not coincide wholly with one's own.
A couple more.
Hi, Andrew Carr from the Lowy Institute. Thank you for your paper. I want to ask you about the Chinese view on confidence-building measures. To what degree is, which you've described as paradoxical and against the logic of that's generally accepted for these measures, to what degree is that a real view that must be engaged with and come to understood, or is it perhaps a proxy or a bargaining position that before China agrees to the conduct in international norms and to abide by them, it first wants some of its kind of core strategic interests kind of rewarded for that behaviour?
Thanks. And up towards the back.
Thanks, Andrew. Don Rothwell from the ANU College of Law. One of the major issues that the region faces is the question as to whether there exist islands in the South China Sea, or whether there exist rocks, or whether there exist artificial installations. And I'm going to ask a legal question, but I welcome your views. That is, would you see some merit in an advisory opinion being sought from either the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea as to the interpretation of Article 121 of the Convention on the Law of the Sea as to what constitutes rocks, what constitutes islands, to therefore give some greater certainty as to the capacity to proclaim exclusive economic zones and continental shelves off some of those features?
That's a humdinger. I'll get Rory to have a shot at those, and then we'll move down. Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much. Running through them all, and I think I can see places where my colleagues might add particular value on some of those answers. The law one's all yours, Raoul. No, look, Denise, on France, no, we didn't focus much on France at all, and partly because, although I've used the term Indo-Pacific, we're at this stage focusing on, I guess, the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean rather than the South Pacific, although in the long run, I guess we do need to think about that, and France is obviously a player in both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. I'd actually almost see its role in the Indian Ocean as more important than its role in the Pacific, but we really did confine our focus to China, United States, Japan, India, not much on Russia either, which I'm waiting for a curly question on shortly. But look, I think especially in the Indian Ocean, I wouldn't mind seeing some more work done on how countries like Australia and India can perhaps coordinate with France. Look, and I'm not sure if Justin, you have anything to add on the French
I think to say that we actually do a reasonable amount of work for what is a small naval presence from France in the region, and it stems across the Indian Ocean right through to the Pacific. And I guess that the primary focus of it is out of EMEA on an annual large activity, bilateral activity that we do with the French. So there are certainly connections there that can be leveraged.
Once France starts having a few spats with China, then maybe it'll become more of a focus for us. Doug Keane, your question about trust, that really goes to the core of the paper, and we tried not to be too philosophical about it. We took trust as Chinese interlocutors expressed it to us as essentially being about a harmonisation of strategic interests. In other words, or at least a recognition, an acceptance, an accommodation of certain Chinese strategic interests. And in that sense, we don't see it as attainable in the near term, perhaps attainable never. Our conclusion was that we have to build stability without trust. So we didn't go too far to define what trust meant. We prefer, I guess, the notion of confidence, that is, notion of understanding, being able to anticipate, predict, understand another country's moves, and I guess recognising that their intent is not necessarily going to be threatening. So we'd rather focus more on confidence than on trust. I'll answer the other questions briefly and then see if you want to have anything to add there, Raoul or Andrew. And this connects with Andrew Carr's question on CBMs, which is a great question. Is this just some sort of negotiating ploy by China? It's interesting that the Chinese view of CBMs on land is much more conventional, much closer to, I guess, what you'd call the Western view, and that therefore does lead you to conclude that maybe this is some sort of temporary ploy. But I don't think that Beijing is looking for some sort of, lip service or some sort of, basic acknowledgement of its maritime core interests. I think it runs deeper than that, and I do think that there is actually a fundamental difference of views that has to be worked out. There's some movement within the Chinese debate on this. The challenge for us is that every time there's pushback against assertive action by China, as we've seen in the last year or two, that can be seen to reinforce both the hardline and the moderate views in the Chinese debate. The hardliners will say, we told you so, those guys can't be trusted. The moderates will say, look, this is going to lead to bloodshed and tears. We conclude in the paper that sadly it could be that the region will need a very close-run thing, a really dangerous incident that actually has some degree of escalation before that debate shifts fully within China. And of course that's a risk that no sane person is going to advocate taking. Look, on the legal point, as far as I could tell, there'd certainly be no harm in that kind of initiative. It's really a question of whether any of the parties would be particularly interested, because my assumption would be that it's going to be very hard to predict who's going to win and who's going to lose once you start that kind of process. And I would have thought that not only the Chinese but some of the Southeast Asian claimants wouldn't be especially interested. But that's Andrew, you might have a more refined view on that as a
not really, but
as a law student.
I do think I do think you need to be careful what you ask for, in a sense, and that the consensus I think that we discovered around the region is that these differences are very, very deep and in a way insoluble, and that the best you might get in any sort of foreseeable period, the next decade, the next 2 decades, the best we might be able to hope for is some sort of political agreement to sort of put those differences to one side and work together cooperatively, whether it's on issues to do with, navigation through those waters, or what's at the nub of a lot of this, obviously, which is the sort of vast, largely untapped mineral resources. So I think you'd want to game out pretty carefully where asking even for an advisory legal opinion led you, particularly in the current circumstances where this whole thing, frankly, is something of a tinderbox. Raoul?
Yeah, just to get back to Doug and Andrew's question quickly. I think both questions go to the heart of the issue, which is really that while these incidents tend to be sort of manifesting themselves in a fairly, in some ways trivial, sometimes faintly comical way, these motley flotillas sort of jostling at sea, that they do really reflect very deep-seated clashes of interest, which each major power is pursuing singularly, and which ultimately go to the sense of prestige, security, and economic well-being in each capital. And those kinds of things, unfortunately, militate against any sort of compromising attitude towards negotiations and discussions. Just on Andrew's point, very quickly, I think in some ways it's important in all of this not to try and sort of put China in not to try and reduce its what it's doing in moral terms, I guess. The basic point is that, for 3 and more decades of pretty staggering economic growth, China has actually very little to show for it geopolitically, despite the fact that, economically it's obviously lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, but geopolitically things really haven't changed. And it's only really natural, I think, for a great power to, begin asserting itself and testing its influence. And the best place, the most opportune the most opportunistic place to do that is really where there's an asymmetry of power, and that sort of begins in the South China Sea. And I think beginning with trying to exclude the US from its surveillance activities in the South China Sea is probably where China feels is a sort of baseline to begin discussions.
Thanks, Raoul. Let's take another burst of questions. So over here down the front.
Hi, John Blackson from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. You talked about various forums for confidence building measures, and a lot of them tend to revolve around ASEAN. And also a lot of the countries that are directly affected by what's going on are actually ASEAN countries. And yet you haven't spoken really very much about ASEAN's role. I wonder if you could comment, please, on where ASEAN fits in on all of this.
Thank you. We'll come down the front and then up to Hugh.
Thank you very much. My name is Boado. I'm the Spanish ambassador. What kind of role do you attach to Vietnam in this regional geostrategical position, especially the relations between Vietnam and China?
Thank you. Hugh. And then Rob.
Thanks, Andrew. Hugh White from ANU and the Lowy Institute. I want to ask two questions, which I think are kind of linked. The first one picks up from Raoul's, I think, very useful observations in the last round. And that is the question of what's actually at stake between, and let's clear the others away, the US and China in this issue. Because I think you're absolutely right in the analysis you've presented that this word, whether we use trust or whatever to describe it, what's at stake here is a very deep divergence in some basic strategic perceptions between these two powers. And at least on the basis of the presentation you've given, I don't get a sense that you've dug very deeply into what really is the difference. What is it that China is not getting that it wants? What is it that America is asserting that China is not prepared to accept? Because it does seem to me that the long term, that CBMs are a band-aid on a longer term adjustment of these conflicting strategic perceptions. And I think I'd just be interested in what you've learnt, and perhaps I've done your paper an injustice, in what you've learnt about what the real difference is. And I think the answer to that might actually be pretty interesting. The second question goes to your judgment about the probability or the likelihood that one of these, as Raoul says, sort of slightly comic opera of sort of transactions somewhere on the Chinese littoral turns out to be something really ghastly. In your presentation, you say that you think the risks of that are pretty low. But the logic of the paper and the logic of your policy actually is the risk is pretty high. I mean, it might only be a 1% risk, but it's a 1% risk of a truly dreadful outcome. And so I'm wondering, if I can put it in this impertinent way, do you really think it's that low? Because I actually think it's quite high. And I was wondering if there's an analytical basis for you thinking that it's low, or you just don't want to be too gloomy. You don't want to be as gloomy as me, in other words.
Thanks, Hugh. And Ron down the front.
Thanks, Andrew. Ron Huskin, ANU. Congratulations on a very sensible analysis and a set of recommendations. One quick observation. At the heart of every confidence-building measure ever devised is some form of, or additional transparency in some form. And China clearly has a very deep-seated problem with movement on that. I remember doing battle with them in the late 80s in UN fora. It was just impossible. But the question it seems that I'd like to add is that when you, an important piece of flavour, if you like, when you're addressing this set of questions is that 2009-10 was not the first time that there was an upsurge in Chinese sharpness, if you like. In the early 1900s and the early 2000s, it's probably the third time at least. And that reiteration, if you like, it seems to me, goes a long way in the direction of where Hugh was going, if you like, that there is I like to think in terms of China road testing what it calls its comprehensive national power, and seeing what geopolitical movement occurs, and when the costs get too high, you pull back and you engage in a lot of soft stuff, fisheries agreements and exploratory agreements and so on. But you don't give up anything of substance. You don't constrain yourself, and you can come back again with a package of incentives and constraints. Is that a proposition which is inserted in your analysis, or would you agree with it?
So, Rory, you can tackle the role of ASEAN and the role of Vietnam in particular, and then defend yourself against the allegation of being Pollyanna-ish.
No, not at all. Ron, not at all. Coming from Hugh, that's a compliment. Ron, look, I'll just very quickly, and again, colleagues may have things to add on this, and I might even come back to you, Ron, on your point, because I'd like to even get a little bit more sort of, I guess, fine-tuned questioning from you if we have time, but if not, outside. On ASEAN, I mean that in the nicest non-confrontational way. Look, of course ASEAN's role diplomatically is important, but we don't, and my colleagues might differ here, certainly personally I don't see ASEAN itself as a particularly coherent strategic actor on a lot of these issues. There are some ASEAN countries that feel much more strongly, I think, about China's actions in the South China Sea than others, and obviously Vietnam and Philippines are, in their view, the frontline states at the moment. ASEAN's very useful as a convening hub, as a centre for forums, but these forums, especially the East Asia Summit, for example, are not going to really deliver, in my view, unless major powers agree to let these forums, to open themselves up to allowing these forums to discussing their core strategic challenges. The United States is obviously quite keen for this to happen. China at this stage isn't. So I don't want to overplay ASEAN's role as a strategic actor. I guess I am more interested in looking at key ASEAN or key Southeast Asian players as individual actors, and obviously Vietnam is one of the most interesting of those. If you take a Chinese perspective on this, of course, China's not the only player that's being a bit belligerent. There's all sorts of interesting editorials in the Chinese press that are emphasising that, in their view, that the Vietnamese are looking for a confrontation, and that if they want one, they'll get one. There was a particularly bleak editorial in the Global Times last week which suggested some pretty confrontational thinking in Beijing. So we certainly need to study, I think, some of the drivers of Vietnam's policy a bit more. We didn't do this so much in this paper because we were focusing on major powers, and we can define that in another conversation. But if I was to identify 2 or 3 areas to further work, I'd certainly want to look at the individual agencies within China, what their agendas are, and the dynamics of Vietnam's policy. Hugh, your question is absolutely integral, and if I was writing a paper called Power Shift, I would most certainly have attempted to answer it properly. We've attempted to look at that in our previous paper, Power and Choice. This paper was a less ambitious paper. It might be about Band-Aids, but someone's got to make Band-Aids. I mean, life would still be a bit miserable if Band-Aids didn't exist. We see CVMs as frankly about buying time. We don't see them as a solution to core strategic differences, resolving the differences between China's and America's grand strategies. But we do see a need to buy time, because when we said that the risks of escalation are small and yet the danger is big, I guess what we mean is the risk that each particular incident will lead to conflict is pretty small. But if you have more and more incidents occurring, and I know statisticians will argue about this, but if incidents become more frequent, the chance that sooner or later one of them is going to blow up is going to rise, and moreover, the accumulation of incidents is going to worsen strategic mistrust and make it harder to resolve any incident once it occurs. But I'm not going to attempt to tell you what China's grand strategy is now, partly because I take a view that there are plenty of thinkers in China who don't know the answer to that question either, and I tend to adhere much more to the sort of the accident and stuff-up theory of history than the conspiracy theory of history, and I mean that more generously than it sounds. I think I'll leave it. Look, Ron, your question about transparency in particular, again, goes to the core of the paper. Obviously, one of the reasons for China's reluctance to engage in maritime CBMs relates to its unwillingness to become more transparent. But we do think that there's been movement on this front. I mean, China's land CBMs are reasonably good, even with India, they're better than they were, and even in, I guess, superficial ways, we have seen movement on transparency in China. Every defence white paper is meant to be an improvement on the last, and so on. So I wouldn't. I guess I wouldn't see transparency as ultimately being, a fundamental obstacle. I think it's more of a case of different players within China working out what they want, and I think there are tensions within China on this greater than a lot of us realise. And ultimately, I think we simply need to buy time through CBMs and other measures so that perhaps over time there might be a greater realisation in China that the difference between its core strategic interests and those of others, that those differences are not going to be easily resolved, and therefore it's in everyone's interest that a less confrontational approach be taken. So that's their end of the optimism for the day. Raoul?
Yeah. Just on John's point about ASEAN, like Rory, it's a fairly marginal player, I think. And in fact, the lack of cohesion among ASEAN states is actually one of the, in some respects, a bit of an aggravating factor because it actually invites opportunism from China. It's the kind of because they. The states of ASEAN all mistrust each other so badly. There's a real. It's actually quite easy for China to, play divide and conquer. On Vietnam, it's a really interesting question, and where Vietnam is one of these sort of pivot countries. And, it's going to be particularly interesting, I think, to see the evolution of the US-Vietnam relationship, which a few decades ago was obviously unthinkable. But ultimately, I think, Vietnam's geographical situation is such that it's going to actually have to accommodate Chinese preferences and concerns just by virtue of the fact that China's geography imposes itself to such an extent because it lies so directly on its maritime fringe. And just to go to Hugh's point, I think when I was talking about a fundamental clash of interest, ultimately what's going on here, in my view, and I think this does actually come out in the paper, is that there is ultimately a hegemonic competition underway in Asia, and the overweening US maritime presence, which extends right up to China's direct maritime periphery, is the principal impediment to China's ability to actually establish a new regional hierarchy at which it sits at the top. On the second point, just about the risks, very quickly. We had some interesting discussions with some senior US naval officers in Washington. And one of the interesting things they said was that actually maritime incidents have a bit of a self-contained dynamic, whereas on land, territory's been broached and borders are much more sort of porous, and territory is able to be seized and held. At sea, the sea has this remarkable stopping power. So when there's an incident, even if there is an exchange of fire or something like that, everybody sort of has to stop, take a breath, go back to the capitals, work out what's happened out there, and sort of return. And in fact, if you look at the Changnan incident, that's very much what happened. I mean, as they had to conduct an investigation and all sorts of things, and in the meantime, cooler heads sort of prevailed. Paradoxically, one of these senior naval officers actually pointed out that the fact that these are a little bit more self-contained, these incidents, actually means that you can be a bit more bold in using them as an instrument of foreign policy and coercion, because you can be relatively assured that it's not actually going to redound or escalate into an outright conflict.
I think one of the concerns that arises from that is that although there has been that, comfort zone, we got the impression that as incidents accumulate, it's going to be harder and harder to, build communication channels, build crisis response mechanisms if each incident actually contributes to mistrust. So it may not be that comfort zone will hold forever. Hence the note of pessimism, Hugh, despite the optimism. Thanks. Running out of time, I think.
Well, I did promise or threaten, depending on your perspective, to wrap things up as close to on time as I can, and I'm delivering on that promise. But I want to thank you all very much for coming and for your interest in the Institute's work. I want to thank Rory and the team for producing what I think is a great piece of research at a very important time, which sees to it that Australia, which has a massive interest in how these issues play out, it helps to ensure that Australia has a voice out there in the regional debate on this as well. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues. I'd encourage you to register for our Food for Thought series in Canberra if you haven't done that already. I'd encourage you to visit our website, and I'd encourage you, although more cautiously, to blog and tweet if that's your proclivity with our interns at the Institute. But thanks again for coming.